Hi, I'm your host, Alyssa Grenfell. Before the episode begins, we have a few notes for listeners. This podcast is hosted by me and veteran attorney Tim Kosnoff, but you'll also hear other voices from our production team introducing topics and guests.
Our team produced this podcast with the mission to educate people on the issue of child abuse in the LDS community, help victims of abuse, and encourage us all to work together to help fix this issue.
We occasionally use excerpts of speeches by leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, publicly available on their website. These excerpts are used under fair use for the purposes of commentary and public interest.
If you're listening and anything you hear feels close to home, please know it should not have happened to you. You are not alone. There are people who believe you, and we can help. Episode transcripts, resources, and our contact form are available on our website, architectureofabuse.com.
This podcast contains discussions of child sexual abuse. Please listen with care.
This is Architecture of Abuse. I'm your host, Alyssa Grenfell. Episode 2, The Response. I'm kind of shocked by how little this is kind of in the collective knowledge of members or ex-members.
Perhaps it's that this one's the hardest to justify. It's really hard to defend this, as you just have to deny that it's a problem or that the church does what it actually does.
The victim should always be the priority, more than the perpetrator, more than the reputation of the church. Getting the victim resources and getting them safe is number one.
Well, just like Catholic bishops and archbishops and cardinals are bishops, the privilege, the power, what more do you need? Because they're not accountable to anybody. They're certainly not accountable to the members. They're not accountable to the law. They're not accountable to the federal government to pay taxes. They have unlimited power.
That really, really shocked me, and that woke me up to, okay, this isn't just another mainstream Christian religion with a few quirks. This is something far more fundamental with capacity for harm.
The police aren't involved. There's no police report because the whole purpose of the helpline is to prevent this from getting to the police in the first or second instance or at all.
And when it comes onto the helpline and what that represents, we know that this isn't just by sort of poor management or negligence. This is actually a deliberate policy. It's still really perplexing that the severity of the harm, the cost, as you say, is so great. How could it even be tolerated?
Hi, it's Lindsay, executive producer here. Our podcast mission is to raise awareness about the scope of child sexual abuse within the LDS Church and to highlight how the Church's methods of responding to this abuse can be problematic and often result in protecting abusers.
We hope our listeners share our belief that accountability is a crucial step toward healing and justice for victims and is essential to preventing additional child abuse within the LDS community. In this episode, we invite you to take a clear-eyed view of the vast financial and professional resources of the LDS Church and how those resources are used in the context of abuse cases. We also encourage listeners to distinguish between the leadership of the Church and the members who faithfully follow them and choose to practice the LDS faith. Our goal is that we can all work together, especially within church membership, to effect change that supports victims and prevents future harm.
Eric Phillips, executive producer. In episode 1, we referenced the reckoning of the Catholic Church when they were exposed for their systemic efforts to cover up sex abuse in their midst. As you'll see throughout the podcast, there are parallels between the LDS Church and the Catholic Church. But a key difference is how the LDS Church chooses to respond to this issue. One way the Church responded to the widespread issue of sex abuse in its communities was to install a helpline for church leaders to call when members report sexual abuse. Members were instructed to report abuse to their leaders, not law enforcement. And bishops were instructed to report to the helpline, not to law enforcement. But sadly, what victims did not understand, and what many bishops did not understand, is that this helpline was designed as anything but a helpline for them. And this helpline still exists today.
From what I understand, the church operated something called a helpline that was used by ecclesiastical leaders so that if they had a question about how to approach a specific instance with someone who had come to them to confess something and they didn't quite know how to handle it or how to respond, that ecclesiastical leader could use this helpline to get advice from the church. Can you explain how that worked and kind of give background as to what that was within the organization?
Well, what you described is that's the cover story. The real story is it's a helpline for the church and its lawyers to identify cases before anybody talks to the cops, lawyers, reporters, or any of this leaks out. It's all about protecting the church. These are lawyers, and lawyers are supposed to vigorously represent their clients and to protect their clients from liability, criminal liability, civil liability. That's what lawyers are supposed to do in our legal system.
And lawyers here represent the church as their client.
Absolutely.
The client is not the person who has a crime against them.
Correct. They're representing, first and foremost, exclusively, the interests of the Mormon Church. They're not representing the victims. That's not their role. That would be a conflict of interest. And here you have somebody who's been abused by an agent of the church, or the church was somehow responsible. So the helpline is an early warning detection system. So that's what the helpline is.
We've urged bishops, stake presidents, and others to reach out to victims, to comfort them, to strengthen them, to let them know that what happened was wrong, that the experience was not their fault, and that it need never happen again. We've issued publications, established a telephone line where church officers may receive counsel in handling cases, and offered professional help through LDS Family Services. These acts are often criminal in their nature. They're punishable under the law. Professional counselors, including lawyers and social workers, are available on this helpline to advise bishops and stake presidents concerning their obligations in these circumstances.
And the way it worked initially was the phone rang in to a staff of 2 or 3 individuals there, and they had a form. We have a few specific questions. And so question number 1, did the abuse occur on church property? Okay, so this is a helpline, right? It's supposed to help victims. Why does it matter whether it happened on church property or not if you want to help this victim? Did it happen in the context of a church-sponsored activity? Kid got sexually abused. Well, they're a member and, we want to help them, right? Next question. Do you have reason to believe that the perpetrator was known to have committed similar acts? These are not help questions. These are lawyer questions seeking to find out whether the church has potential civil liability, okay? Because every one of those categories is a legal basis to hold the church civilly responsible. Has it been reported to the police? If you are a mandated reporter, see first if you can't get the perpetrator to turn himself in and report it himself. And if the perpetrator won't, see if you can get a family member to do it. In other words, the church doesn't want to be involved in reporting, but we also don't want to be held accountable. So just see if you can get somebody else to do it. If it has to be done, don't do it yourself because you're our agent and we don't want to be involved in that. Okay, well, what's the problem with asking the perpetrator? Well, on what planet do you think a criminal defendant is going to, turn himself into the police? It also said that before, if you can convince the perpetrator who, if that's the source of the information about which you're calling, which is almost never the case, but assuming in that rare instance the abuser discloses to the bishop, then before you let him go talk to the police, make sure that he obtains legal counsel. There's not a lawyer in the world that is going to allow his client under these circumstances to walk into a police station and say, I've been abusing 6-year-olds, on my babysitting. So that was how the system worked. The police aren't involved. There's no police report because the whole purpose of the helpline is to prevent this from getting to the police in the first or second instance or at all. So that's how it has successfully worked.
They're really absolving themselves of any chance that they might be held accountable.
Well, eventually that information needs to be obtained, but it's going to be obtained by the lawyer directly from the bishop. So it's now shielded, it's protected. So This is an example of how they use legal privileges as a sword and a shield to protect themselves, the church, from having to produce information in discovery that would be adverse to their interests and position in the case.
As information about the church's resources have become more public, outsiders have taken notice. Murray Jones is an investigative journalist who had no prior connection to the LDS Church. While living in New Zealand, he was assigned to look into the finances of the nation's charitable sector and discovered that the LDS Church was one of the wealthiest registered charities in the country, with vast income and real estate holdings. But that investigation led him down another path, resulting in the creation of his podcast called Heaven's Helpline, which explores many of the same issues we're discussing in this episode. The depth and breadth of the church's financial power is staggering, and we'll get into that shortly. But the stories that Murray discovered while investigating the Helpline reveal the impact that the church's system have on victims and their families.
So I did the 3-part series, and they came out, and it got quite a lot of reaction online. And I just wanted to speak to more people, particularly more women, because just by having tried to speak to ex-leaders in the church initially for money, the money side of things, I hadn't spoken to that many women, and I wanted to get more of women's experience on the record.
Where did that investigation lead once you started?
I started talking to more and more people who had been in the church. Obviously I'd collected a few sources from the money investigation. And what I found was asking them about abuse cases, abuse cover-ups, abusers being forgiven. It wasn't hard for people to come up with cases that they knew about from friends, or family members, or just cases that happened in their ward. So, once I kind of opened that box, all the cases came flying about me, really. Once we got those, spoke to those people, the patterns of behavior and institutional behavior became quite apparent. So we had one story of a woman we called Jade. She married quite young, not that young for a woman, but, about age, I think 20 or 21, had children with this guy. She thought he was great. He was a missionary and he'd done everything great. The relationship started to just have a little bit of trouble 4 or 5 years in, and she felt something was off. And then it transpired that her husband had been sexually abusing her child's sister for the duration of the marriage, essentially. When this came out, the first thing that they did was they had an emergency meeting with their bishop. Now, again, as an outsider, the idea that would be your first port of call when something so extreme had happened was quite remarkable. But for those in the church, that would make complete sense. But then what that bishop told her was the most important thing you can do is to basically forgive and stay with your husband, because the importance of eternal life as a family, is far more important and has far greater rewards than anything that could happen in this life. So she believed that, and she took that in, even though it kind of went against all of her instincts as a mother and as a sister, and stay with that man who was a pedophile, sex abuser, stay living with their 2 children in the house. And they moved to a new area where this guy's family was all about. So he was kind of protected and boosted up. And eventually he was given leadership positions in this new area and was essentially redeemed within the church. And that bishop in the new area said it's important that you do not report this to police. 1, it would embarrass the church. And 2, it's more important to keep your family together. Essentially, you have a shot at redemption. You don't need to ruin it by confessing your crimes to the police.
It follows that the great work of every man is to believe the gospel, to keep the commandments, and to create and perfect an eternal family unit, and to help others do the same.
And I will say the first bishop did advise him that he should report him to the police. He didn't do anything about that. He didn't follow it up. He didn't choose to report it himself. And he did advise, as I said, his wife, Jade, to stay with him. But he did at least say the right thing to do would be to report yourself. But the second bishop said, no, do not report. We will look after you.
As we ask why church leaders choose to respond to abuse cases this way, it's important to understand that money is not an issue for them. In 2019, an employee of the LDS Church, David Nielsen, filed a whistleblower complaint with the IRS. After 9 years working as a senior portfolio manager for the church's investments at Ensign Peak, Among other things, he presented evidence that the church had been hiding over $100 billion. In an interview with 60 Minutes, he said that the firm masqueraded as a charity and violated its tax-exempt status. He described the firm as a clandestine hedge fund, saying the church was not actually using the amount of funds for charitable purposes that it had claimed. The Widows Might Report, a website developed to document the church's finances, estimates the church's overall wealth to be around $293 billion. To put this into perspective, the Catholic Church, the largest Christian religion in the world, is estimated to be worth only 10 to 15 billion. So even though the Catholic Church has approximately 1.3 billion members compared to the LDS Church's 17 million members, the LDS Church's estimated net worth is about $280 billion more. With resources this vast, it gives the church power to financially back highly problematic architecture and attitudes in dealing with abuse. And it makes obtaining proper justice for victims very difficult.
First of all, let's make no mistake. The Mormon Church is corporate religion on steroids. It's about money. Now, they try and keep this secret, but we know there's some leaks, and there was like just one fund sitting on, was it $100 billion? There have been attempts to calculate what the church is worth. Effort was done by a sociologist and an LDS scholar, Anson Shoup and John Heilman. And they went back and looked at real estate records, corporate records, SEC filings, and so forth. And what they were able to find and extrapolate from was that the church was taking in, and this was like in 1985, roughly $7 to $10 billion a year in tithing. And they thought that their asset worth was about $125 billion. Now, this is the 1980s. They found out through their research of land records that the church was the largest landowner in the state of Florida, the state of Nebraska, that they had interests that were so far-flung that the leaders of the church probably couldn't tell you what the church owned. Radio stations, television stations, newspapers, insurance companies, banks. About 25 years ago, I was still involved in the Scott case. Well, I was always on the lookout if there were any, some insiders that were willing to talk. Pretty hard to find. But my investigator, she found a golden nugget. This was a man who had been the comptroller for the church. I mean, if there's anybody that knew what the church owned, it was the comptroller of the church. And I was able to interview him, and he was even willing to testify in the Scott trial on the punitive damages aspect as to what the church's net worth was. He told me that he had read Shoup and Heileman's book. He thought it was conservative, that it was an understatement of how much wealth it had. But he thought it was, it was pretty close to what they had at that time. The bottom line is that they have so much money, they can't spend the money they have. Just the interest and the dividends on the wealth that they have couldn't be spent. At the beginning, I was just too naive, too unprepared, too dumb to know better. I just thought, I'll write up a lawsuit complaint, we'll bring it. And, when they see the strength of our allegations, they'll fold and they'll make a settlement and that'll be that. But in the Jeremiah Scott case, it just went on and on and on and on. Other lawyers who might have had the resources and the ability to do it probably never could have convinced their partners that they should take on the Mormon Church in a litigation where they were going to have to be advancing potentially millions of dollars in advanced costs, spending thousands of hours going up against this institution. It just didn't pencil out economically because they are so wealthy and so well-resourced, and they have demonstrated to lawyers that if you want to file a lawsuit against us, you need to be prepared to spend unlimited amounts of money because they can use the legal system, its flexibility to stretch out a litigation over time, make it incredibly expensive. And I'm stubborn. I was a good high school football player. I loved running into people and knocking them down. I mean, I loved the contact sport. And that's how I sell this kind of litigation. It's a contact sport. And the LDS Church apparently likes to play football too. So,
and I can understand, I can understand these attitudes where men are protected, the welfare of men more important than the welfare of women. Those are patterns we see in every society throughout history. But when it's such an egregious crime against children, and still a good standing member of the community can say, do not report that to the police, we want to cover that up, that boggled my mind. Yeah, it showed the power and the influence of the bishop.
I think this goes to the core of how the system really works, which is a male-dominated, hierarchical system. It's about protecting the male priesthood.
To the priesthood of this church throughout the world, God has bestowed upon us a gift most precious and wonderful. It carries with it the authority to govern the church, to speak with authority in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, to act as his dedicated servants, to bless the sick, to bless our families and many others. It serves as a guide by which to live our lives. In its fullness, its authority reaches beyond the veil of death into the eternities that lie ahead. There is nothing else to compare with it in all this world.
I was curious if I was someone who had been sexually assaulted and I'm going to my bishop, I'm reporting this to him, and this is obviously something that plays out quite often. What would happen today with that information?
It would depend on the bishop. Here's where common sense and civic responsibility collide with church teachings. This is the Lord versus the law, if you will. The Lord, according to the church, says that the bishop is the father of the ward, and that members have a duty to take all of their problems first, and perhaps exclusively, to the bishop. He has the power of discernment, and you are to trust the guidance and wisdom of the bishop. What I do know is he doesn't have the training, the education, or the authority to deal with crime, and this is a violent crime. So yet, I know within Mormonism from the earliest age, people are told, not only is this available to you, you must do this, you must bring this. And as we all know, the bishop has regular worthiness interviews and has many opportunities to interact with all members of the ward. And I can tell you that in dealing with juries, most of, who are non-Mormon, they don't understand it at all. A child's been abused, and the first question is, well, why didn't the mom and dad go to the police? Why would you take a situation like this to the guy he's your bishop and he's a dentist and, he's got a full-time job doing this, that, or the other thing? What makes you think he's qualified to deal with somebody who's raped your child or sexually assaulted your daughter or you?
It doesn't make sense, and yet it happens all the time, which is kind of crazy from what you've shared.
Well, again, it's, if you make that choice as an adult to not report that you were raped or sexually assaulted, and you choose instead to follow the instructions of the church, then that's on you. But when it comes to kids, I've got no sympathy. This is the collision between wrong-headed religious instruction and common sense.
There'd been a man who'd been convicted and sentenced to nearly the maximum penalty for violent abuse and sexual abuse of his wife over I think nearly 2 decades. And he was appealing his sentence because it was on the higher end, which was denied. So I don't know. I haven't spoken to anyone involved in this case, so I don't know it that well. But what was really striking, just from basically the judge's summary of the case, I thought I'd actually read this because it's quite powerful. The judge said, in addition to the physical injuries, it has affected the victim's trust, her relationship with her children, and her ability to tolerate physical contact, as well as cause significant mental health issues, including depression, suicidality, OCD, eating disorder, and PTSD. This harm was exacerbated by the former couple's involvement in the Mormon Church, which led the victim to place considerable weight on remaining in the marriage. Now, I had found that out in the Jade's case, of a similar thing. It was the weight placed on staying in the marriage that led to so much of this harm being done to her and her suffering. But to see that laid out by a judge who tend to be very conservative in their language when it comes to the cause and effect of sort of an institutional membership, particularly a religious one, I just found that quite staggering. That was in October 2024, and that judgment came out. So we also had judges' comments there was a case in 2008 where a man had been sexually harassing women and even a dog at one point that he was charged with, but he moved around to 3 different areas, and essentially the various bishops in different wards knew of his offending, and he'd confessed to this to his bishops, but they kept allowing him to move to new areas and reoffend. And the judge in that case, when he was finally convicted, said, "I'm reluctant to criticize any religious institution, but it's clear that the church trying to deal with this behavior in-house was ineffective and clearly led to more victimization." And, the church was criticized for that by a judge in New Zealand in 2008. There's over 15 years between those 2 judges' comments. And when it comes on to the helpline and what that represents, we know that this isn't just by sort of poor management or negligence. This is actually a deliberate policy.
As you approach this investigation, as people are kind of coming forward, what are you understanding about how the organization of the church is fostering this level of abuse?
Well, the thing that the church does so effectively is it instills attitudes and beliefs almost at every level. So, on the individual level, the ingrained messages about the role of men and women, the sanctity of marriage, but also the importance of priesthood authority, that ingrains from a very young age, prioritizing men's welfare over women's, essentially, putting it simply. And so that, as a foundation layer baked into every individual, is a very effective strategy.
Your future husbands and the men with whom you serve will need the support only you can give. You have an inner spiritual strength that President James E. Faust said equals, quote, and even surpasses that of men, unquote. Do not abdicate your spiritual responsibility.
But in more specific instances, the way that the church creates a pipeline of all issues, all problems that individual members or families might have, has to go through the bishop. As an outsider, I would have had no idea of this prior, the absolute essential role that the bishop plays in acting as the first port of call for all these kind of problems. And what this creates is often there's a sense of bishop roulette, right? Where if you've got a great bishop and there's many of them out there, then they'll do their best to be kind and look after you and do what they think's best.
The bishop is the father of the ward. He has many responsibilities, but his main purpose in all he does is to watch over and strengthen individuals and families in the gospel.
But ultimately, it's ingrained in bishops, both doctrinally, but also just for their own self-interest, to obey the church and do not do anything that may harm the church's reputation. Again and again through the conversations I was having, what really shocked me was this notion of the good name of the church, the reputation of the church, and that being held up as so important.
So, what's in the name? When it comes to the name of the Lord's church, the answer is everything.
And again, coming as an outsider, the fact that so much emphasis was put on the good name of the church set alarm bells ringing, certainly. If individual members and local leaders feel that the reputation of the church trumps individual members' welfare, then you've got a recipe for disaster, really, when it comes to cases of sexual abuse.
Most damage to the collective reputation of the church is done by those who want to straddle the line. Those who so compromise their principles want to play for both teams at once, the Lord's and Satan's. We would do well to remember the words quoted by President McKay, "Whate'er thou art, act well thy part."
There's both the individual rationale and then there's the institutional rationale. And the institutional rationale is somewhat easier to ascribe because it's self-preservation to a degree. The church, historically, if it started kicking out all the nasty men in its ranks who were behaving from unkind to criminally towards women, then it might not have had that many members back in its early days. And so I think once that morality is ingrained, it's hard to shift it. But it's still really perplexing that the severity of the harm, the cost, as you say, is so great. How could it even be tolerated? But I suppose on the individual level, why people are complicit in cover-ups is fear. They're scared that if they speak out, if they're the one to speak out, their whole family, their whole ward, perhaps even their God will turn against them. And so most people are not renegades. So I think just on that, psychological individual level, it's really hard for people, even when all their instincts say, I need to call this out, or I need to walk away, or I need to protect my family. Even, that ingrained fear is pretty powerful just on its own.
Have you been to Europe and seen the great cathedrals in Europe? No, imagine, you're an impoverished peasant in the 14th century or the 15th century. And as you stand there with nothing, looking up at this, what does it tell you? I think that's why, whether it's the billions they're spending to redo Temple Square, which, seemed like it was good enough. I'm sure it probably needed some maintenance, but $2-3 billion. Travis Kelce and Times Square at Christmas. It's the medieval church telling you you're small. It keeps people in line. It's a mechanism of control. That's how I see it.
As you kind of consider everything you've learned as part of your investigative work, what would you say to people, members who might say, this isn't a systemic issue, this is a few bad apples. Sure, it happened once or twice, but I'm not too worried about it. Or what would you say to someone who shares a sentiment like that with you?
I would say, such a tough one. I would say go and look at the evidence of what the church does when cases of abuse are brought to it. What are local leaders instructed to do? They're immediately instructed to call a helpline that is run by church lawyers. They can't do anything else but act in the church's interest. And we have a situation where we know through decades and decades of evidence through different institutions that churches can be financially liable for enabling abuse, covering up abuse, or being responsible for people who in positions of power who abuse. In that situation, it is in the church's self-interest to try and control and clamp down on situations and stop them reaching civil authorities. And there is so much recorded evidence of that happening. And I think what maybe draws a line between true believing members of the church and those outside is that for many of those true believing members, that's not unusual. The church is the priority. And so that's, for many people, that's not even a controversial stance. But when you look at it in the cold light of day and cases of abuse, the harm and the pain and the injustice that cause is off the scale.
I think when you've resolved to believe the Mormon church and when you have your family riding on it and for some people your livelihood and your culture and your living situation, it can be really difficult to even have an incentive to look beneath the surface. But I think that what changes people's minds the most is when they have it happen to them or when someone that they love has it happen to them. And I think that to me is maybe the other thing I would say to someone who questions, this must be some bad apples or something, is, if this happened to your child, how would you feel if someone said, well, this was just, one time? Or how would you feel if that person was put back into your congregation after you knew that your church had extensive history that this person was a child abuser and they put him in young men's?
There's one quote from a former bishop who since left the church that really stood out to me. throughout the whole investigation, and it's very pertinent to what we've been talking about. It wasn't to do with an abuse case, but it was just about him leaving the church. And he'd been so involved. He'd been in leadership positions his whole adult life, and he finally left. And, people started crossing the street to avoid him, members of his old congregation. And there was no communication from people that used to be in his ward. And he just said, we were taught so much about unconditional love in the church and the love within the community and from our God. And he said, as soon as I left, it felt like the love was extremely conditional. And that really just always stood out to me. And I think that points to so many cases of survivors of abuse and family members of survivors who bring a case to church leaders or bring it to court or just, announce publicly within the congregation about sexual abuse, and they are judged and they are outcast. And I think that notion of conditional love really is a really powerful force and leads to a lot of the harmful behaviors we've talked about.
I think there's a cultural and a organizational disincentive for a bishop to take complaints of sexual abuse of children seriously. And this isn't unique to the Mormon Church. I think you find this in other denominations. It's unpleasant. It's really sort of unthinkable. And unless you have been sensitized to it, trained, educated, and understand its prevalence and your moral and legal obligation, imperative to step in and at least do something that puts it in the hands of somebody qualified to evaluate the circumstance, which are the police, the civil authorities, because bishops are, as we all know, they come from all walks of life, but for the most part, they aren't trained or schooled in grooming or child sexual abuse or any of these things. But the bishop is also, at least of a generation, and maybe it's changed with a younger generation of bishops, they have been fed this Spencer Kimball's Miracle of Forgiveness, which was a book. I want to call it Mormon doctrine because it's become almost doctrinal, even though, to my understanding, it's not doctrine, which, if you read that book, it has been very influential and powerful and has been thematic in the way the church has trained generations of bishops how to understand and deal with allegations of child sexual abuse or spousal abuse, which is to not treat it as what it is, which is a violent criminal offense against a vulnerable victim that needs to be dealt with by secular authorities. Instead, you need to think about it in terms of it being an event that happened jointly between two responsible parties, the adult perpetrator and the child, teenage victim.
I read that. My bishop gave that book to me to read before my mission. And so I was given that book to read as an instrument for my understanding of how I should go out and be a missionary. And that, it says that if your virtue might be threatened, it'd be better to die in the interaction than to allow your virtue to be taken from you. That's just one of a billion quotes from that book that are just fundamentally so, morally messed up.
If this wasn't written by the president prophet of a major religion in the world, you'd say this is wrong. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard accounts of the bishop saying, well, we have to take into account your responsibility in this, to a 12-year-old.
Do you have any other, parting wisdom or stories or anything else that you feel like we didn't get to that feels relevant to the conversation or pertinent or?
I would also just add that since the podcast came out, it's been listened in over 100 countries around the world. And so many people have come forward with their own experiences of abuse cover-up. Or leaders dismissing the experiences of survivors. So that's been quite a profound thing to experience. To put something out there, these collection of stories and the findings of an investigation, and then it was a handful of stories, and then in the case of a couple of weeks after putting it out there, I was flooded with dozens and dozens more. A lot of people were profoundly moved there was the phrase like I feel seen, or this is the first time I've heard this issue addressed in such a way. For some people, they'd only experienced or seen one aspect of that control or that response, and suddenly it felt like they said they were seeing the bigger picture. They were seeing the whole institution laid bare for what it was doing. Yeah, it reframed how they thought about their own abuse and their own experience. A lot of people were really, really, really grateful, and it's wonderful to think that it could have a positive impact in that way.
Yeah, I've been surprised because I read about the church all the time, and the level to which I was unfamiliar with this is kind of shocking to me. Like the level to which this is such a pattern that so many people have unearthed, whether it's lawyers or investigative journalists or legal teams, people telling their stories. I'm kind of shocked by how little this is kind of in the collective knowledge of members or ex-members. I think even members, I've had many conversations with members about how the church was hiding money. It's not like they don't hear these negative stories and have their own opinions, but the fact that this is not even on the map of the conversation is really surprising.
I think perhaps it's that this one's the hardest to justify. Even with the money, there's kind of, there's some workarounds and some justifications out there, but it's really hard to defend this. So you just have to deny that it's a problem, or that the church does what it actually does.
This has been episode 2 of Architecture of Abuse. I'm your host, Alyssa Grenfell, and I want to thank you for listening. Thank you to my co-host, Tim Kosnoff, and our guest, Murray Jones, for sharing his experience. I want to encourage all of you again to listen to his podcast, Heaven's Helpline, and hear more about the stories he referenced in this episode. We appreciate his help in this episode as we highlighted the scope of the abuse, the church's problematic response to it, and what the church chooses to prioritize with its vast resources. Next episode, we'll be joined by 2 experts, Dr. Julie Hanks, an active LDS member and founder of Wasatch Family Therapy, as well as Dr. Stephen Hassan, a mental health professional, expert on undue influence, and author. We'll discuss the doctrinal and cultural issues that exacerbate the architecture of abuse in the church. In your experience as a member and a therapist, what is your take on the helpline?
Yeah, my understanding is that it goes to legal advice. From a therapist's point of view, it should go to a victim advocate first. The victim should always be the priority, more than the perpetrator, more than the reputation of the church. Getting the victim resources and getting them safe is number one.
If you'd like to discuss a potential claim, you can contact me via my website, kosnoff.com. If you are not a survivor but still want to do something to help our community, you can make an impact. Here are some things you can do to help. If someone shares their experience with you, the most important thing you can do is listen with empathy and guide them toward professional resources for support. Support them, but let them decide what is best for them. Contact your local legislators and emphasize your support for removing the clergy penitent privilege in child sexual abuse situations. Churches need to report child abuse to those with the knowledge, training, and authority to deal with these crimes. It is the only way of breaking the chain of abuse. Urge your local legislators to support a look-back window law to give child abuse victims additional time to pursue justice and publicly identify their abusers. Cutting off child sexual abuse survivors' access to the courts at age 21 is unrealistic and wrong-headed because most survivors have not processed the trauma by that age sufficient to take that step. Thank you for listening.
This episode of Architecture of Abuse was hosted by Alyssa Grenfell and Tim Kosnoff. Executive producers are Lindsay Hansen-Park and Eric W. Phillips. Produced, edited, and mixed by Lizzie Bean. Research and fact-checking by Emily Sellers. Music by Ian Post, licensed through Artlist. Special thanks to Murray Jones for joining us. Show notes, transcripts, and additional resources are available at architectureofabuse.com. You can follow us on all platforms at Architecture of Abuse. If this episode resonated with you, please consider leaving a review and sharing it with someone who might benefit from the conversation.
Via email, we asked the LDS Church for comment, and although we didn't get a response, we did inform them we would include their standard policy that abuse of any kind is not tolerated in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.